I had been waiting for this moment for months, splashing the cash, flipping through all the options, and finally walking into the dealership to claim what I'd worked so hard for, a brand new Lamborghini. Pulling into my driveway that day, I couldn't help but feel a rush of pride and excitement. Car gleamed under the sunlight, its sleek body reflecting the world around it. I'd earned every bit of this. It wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of my hard work, my perseverance, and the long hours spent building my career. My neighbors didn't always understand the grind, but that was fine with me. I wasn't in this for their approval, I was in this for myself. The neighborhood I lived in wasn't exactly known for high-end vehicles. It was a nice suburban area where the biggest excitement usually came from a new IKEA opening or someone getting a shiny new SUV. My Lambo, though? It stood out like a sore thumb. But that was exactly why I loved it. It was my personal statement, a clear reflection of everything I had accomplished. My driveway looked nothing like the others, but I didn't mind. This was my success. But not everyone seemed to share my enthusiasm. Just as I was unloading the trunk, tossing my bags into the house, I heard her voice, sharp and demanding. Karen, the neighborhood HOA president, was marching towards me. She was wearing a pair of large sunglasses, despite the cloudy day, and her hand was already on her hip like she was ready to start a confrontation. Karen wasn't new to me. I'd heard stories about her from neighbors. She was infamous for always sticking her nose where it didn't belong, especially when it came to anything related to the neighborhood rules. The woman had been known to send out complaints about overgrown lawns, overly bright porch lights, and anything else she deemed inappropriate for the community. I had met her a few times before, but each interaction had been short and cordial. I knew her reputation, though. Karen took herself very seriously, as if the role of HOA president somehow made her an authority on every aspect of everyone's life. So when I saw her walking toward me, I had a feeling this wouldn't be a casual chat. There was an air of entitlement around her, as though she believed she had a right to tell others how to live their lives. Didn't take long for me to realize that my shiny new car had caught her attention. First, I figured it was just a typical HOA-related complaint. Maybe she was going to give me a lecture about parking, or perhaps she wanted to talk about my lawn care practices, which, mind you, were more than up to snuff. But I couldn't have been more wrong. This encounter was about to take a turn I never saw coming. Without even offering a greeting, Karen wasted no time getting straight to the point. "That car is far too expensive for this neighborhood," she declared, pointing directly at my Lamborghini. Her voice was full of judgment and disdain, as if she was the one who got to decide what cars were acceptable here. She didn't ask if I had the means to afford the car or whether I had worked hard to buy it. No, this was her opinion, and it was the only one that mattered. Before I could even respond, she added, "I think it's inappropriate for you to be driving around in a car like that, and frankly, I don't think it belongs here." She said this with a level of authority that would have made anyone second-guess their position. She stood there, arms crossed, waiting for me to hand over the keys or, at the very least, agree with her unsolicited opinion. But the demand wasn't the worst part, it was the next thing she said. She looked me up and down, a sneer on her face. "A car like that doesn't belong in the hands of someone like you," she spat. The racial undertone was unmistakable. Her words hit me like a punch in the gut, as if my skin color somehow disqualified me from owning a luxury car. She was practically saying, "People like you don't deserve nice things." The weight of her prejudice was obvious. In her mind, I wasn't supposed to be driving a Lamborghini, not because of who I was as a person, but because of what I looked like. It was the kind of thing you read about in news articles but never expect to encounter firsthand. I couldn't believe this woman thought she could get away with it, dismissing my success simply because she hated that I had something she didn't. In that moment, I took a deep breath. The audacity of her words left me speechless for a moment. I had been prepared for a complaint, sure, but nothing could have prepared me for this level of racial arrogance. I felt the anger building inside me, but I knew it wasn't the time to lose my cool. As much as I wanted to yell at her, I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I simply stared at her, taking in the absurdity of her comment. "You're going to have to do better than that if you want to take my car," I said, my voice calm but firm. I wasn't going to let her dictate how I lived my life, or worse, let her racially charge this situation. The idea that I would just hand over my car because of her outdated views was laughable. It was at that point that I knew I wasn't dealing with just any entitled neighbor. I was dealing with someone who had crossed a line that should never be crossed. As soon as I refused to give in to Karen's demand, her whole demeanor changed. Her face turned bright red, her lips curled into a scowl, and her fists clenched at her sides. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" she sneered. Her voice was getting louder, and the passive-aggressive tone turned into outright hostility. "Just because you can afford a toy like that doesn't mean you have the right to flaunt it in front of the rest of us. You're making everyone uncomfortable." Her words rang in my ears, but I kept my cool. I wasn't about to let her drag me into a heated exchange. "This car is mine, and I'm not doing anything wrong by owning it," I told her, my voice firm and steady. "You have no right to tell me what I can and can't do." But that only seemed to infuriate her more. She was now full of rage, barely able to hold herself back. "You've got some nerve," she shouted, stepping forward as if she was about to lunge at me. "I'm going to make sure the HOA knows about this. You'll be banned from even parking it here. Just wait and see. I'll report you and have this car towed away." I wasn't intimidated by her threats, but then she took it a step too far. She pointed directly at the Lamborghini, shaking her finger aggressively. "If you don't give me access to that car right now, I'll make sure it gets scratched up. Just a little reminder that not everyone thinks you deserve it." My stomach churned. It wasn't just words anymore. She was crossing a line. I took a step back, instinctively putting some space between us. She was getting closer, her finger now pointing at the side mirror. "If you even think about touching it," I said through gritted teeth, "I'm calling the cops." Karen didn't listen. Without any warning, she reached out and swiped her hand across the sleek surface of my Lamborghini. It was clear she was trying to damage it. I saw red. My heart started racing, but I didn't let my anger get the best of me. I knew this was exactly what she wanted, to provoke me, to make me react violently so she could play the victim. But I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. "You touch my car again and I'll make sure the cops know exactly what happened," I said, my voice low and controlled. I wasn't backing down. She just stood there, looking at me like she was daring me to make a move. But instead of reacting, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Her face twisted in disbelief as I spoke to the operator, explaining what had happened. I told them she had harassed me and attempted to damage my property. The operator assured me that help was on the way. Didn't take long for the sirens to wail in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Karen's expression went from anger to panic as the flashing lights finally lit up the street. She clearly hadn't expected things to escalate this far. In her mind, she probably thought she could bully me into submission. Instead, she was about to get a rude awakening. 2 officers pulled up in their patrol car, stepping out with a professional air as they assessed the situation. I explained everything calmly, from Karen's demand to the physical confrontation. I could see the disbelief on the officers' faces as they looked at Karen, who was still fuming but now increasingly defensive. I made sure to point out how she had reached out to scratch my car, clearly trying to cause damage. "Ma'am, can you explain what's going on here?" one of the officers asked, turning to Karen. She immediately started rambling about how I was flaunting my wealth and how the car didn't belong in the neighborhood. But as she went on, it was clear that her words weren't adding up. She started accusing me of making her feel uncomfortable, saying I was causing problems for the community. It was a lot of talking in circles, but nothing concrete to justify her actions. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them turned back to Karen. "So, you admit to attempting to damage the vehicle?" he asked, his tone sharp and direct. Karen hesitated for a moment, clearly realizing she had backed herself into a corner. She tried to change her story, but the officers weren't buying it. After a few moments of questioning, they informed Karen that her actions had crossed a line: harassment, property damage, and attempted assault. To my surprise, they cuffed her. The officers explained that Karen had not only violated my rights but also threatened me with physical harm. The whole thing felt surreal. Karen, who had spent years abusing her position in the HOA, was now being escorted to the patrol car in handcuffs. As they led her away, I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief. I had stood my ground and the law was on my side. Karen, the self-righteous HOA president who thought she could control everyone, was now being treated like the criminal she was. Karma had done its job, swift and undeniable. It didn't matter how high up she thought she was. When it came to crossing the line, there were consequences. I watched as the officers put her in the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut with finality. She looked out the window at me, her face a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. I couldn't help but feel a little smug. This wasn't just about a car or a neighborhood dispute, it was about justice being served. Karen had thought she could push me around because of her position, but she had learned the hard way that entitlement doesn't trump the law. After Karen was hauled off in the police car, the dust didn't just settle quickly. The weeks that followed brought a series of consequences for her that were nothing short of dramatic. First, Karen found herself facing legal charges, including harassment, attempted assault, and property damage. The investigation into her actions was thorough, and it was clear from the evidence that her attempts to damage my Lamborghini were intentional. The neighborhood cameras that had captured the altercation, as well as my own phone recording, worked in my favor, ensuring that there was no way for her to deny what had happened. The HOA, which she had once proudly ruled over with an iron fist, took swift action. They began receiving complaints from other residents who had long been uncomfortable with Karen's overbearing attitude, but had kept quiet out of fear. After what happened to me, they finally felt empowered to speak up. The board had no choice but to launch an internal investigation into her actions. Soon enough, Karen was officially removed from her position, and her reign of terror over the community came to an abrupt end. The legal consequences for Karen were just the beginning. She was hit with fines, and her upcoming court date loomed large. Word spread quickly that the entitled HOA president was facing the wrath of not just the law, but also the very community she had once controlled. People who had stayed neutral or distant during her reign began reaching out to offer their support to me. The same people who had once kept their distance from my success were now cheering me on. The neighborhood had witnessed the ugly side of Karen's entitlement and racism, and they weren't standing for it anymore. As for Karen herself, her life turned upside down. Friends and acquaintances who once revered her began to distance themselves. Her behavior had caught up with her, and her privilege had failed to protect her. With legal charges hanging over her head, the social consequences of her actions weighed heavily on her. Karen's sense of superiority, once so firmly rooted in her position as an HOA leader, had been shattered. Reflecting on it all, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. Justice had been served, but more than that, Karen's actions were a wake-up call for the community. People had witnessed what happens when someone thinks they are above the law or their neighbors. The shame she felt as she was dragged into that police car would stay with her long after her court date, and that was a consequence no amount of privilege could erase. Looking back on everything, it became clear that the real lesson in all of this wasn't just about Karen facing legal consequences. It was about karma, the kind that isn't just about legal systems but about the universe setting things right no matter how hard a person tries to escape it. Karen thought she could bully me into submission, that her position in the HOA gave her the power to control me. What she didn't count on was the simple truth that entitlement and prejudice don't go unchecked forever. Sooner or later, the weight of those actions catches up with you. Karma wasn't just about her being arrested or losing her position in the HOA. It was about her learning the hard way that nobody is above the law, not even someone with a self-righteous attitude and a false sense of superiority. She may have been used to pushing people around, but this time the tables were turned. The law stepped in, the community rallied behind me, and Karen was left with nothing but the consequences of her own actions. For me, this situation was a personal victory. I didn't back down when confronted with injustice, and I didn't let racism or entitlement push me into silence. Standing my ground wasn't just about protecting my property, it was about standing up for what was right. And as much as Karen tried to ruin my enjoyment of my hard-earned success, I wasn't about to let her spoil it. If anything, her actions made me even more determined to enjoy the fruits of my labor. I worked hard to get that Lamborghini, and I wasn't going to let anyone, especially not someone like her, make me feel like I didn't deserve it. At the end of it all, I walked away knowing that justice had prevailed. It wasn't always easy, but standing up for yourself in the face of adversity is never a mistake. And I'm proud that, no matter how hard she tried, Karen couldn't take away my success. As for my Lamborghini, well, I still enjoy driving it through the neighborhood, though now I get a lot more smiles and waves from my neighbors than I ever did before. Some things, like karma, just take care of themselves.